Franklin Roosevelt and the Great Depression. His bio: birthplace, Hyde Park, New York, January 30th, 1882 to April 12th, 1945 is when he died. His education: he went to Groton, Harvard, and Columbia. His presidency was from 1933 to 1945. Roosevelt was born into wealth. He passed the bar exam in 1907 and left school without a degree. In 1910, he entered into politics. FDR's political career before presidency: Franklin Roosevelt followed the footsteps of his fifth cousin, Theodore Roosevelt. He entered politics as a Democrat. FDR entered politics at 28 years old. He was seen as handsome, engaged, and blessed with the very familiar last name. In 1910, he won the election for New York Senate. 1913, he was appointed Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Navy. During his time as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Roosevelt specialized in business. He was a very energetic, efficient, and a hardworking administrator. He worked with Congress to get budgets approved, systems modernized, and founded the U.S. Navy Reserve.
So his political career before president continued. In 1920, he was a nominee for vice president with presidential nominee James Cox, but lost to Republican Warren G. Harding and vice presidential running mate Calvin Coolidge. In 1921, he was diagnosed with polio. Polio can be transmitted through contaminated water, food, or being in contact with an infected person. Many people who are infected with polio have no symptoms. However, those who do get sick develop paralysis, which can sometimes be fatal. Roosevelt spent most of his adult life in a wheelchair due to having polio throughout his presidency. In 1929 through 1932, the Great Depression strikes while he is governor of New York.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Here was this aristocrat from Dutchess County, confined to a wheelchair, Harvard educated, but because of his almost innate sense of communication skills and the medium of radio, he was transported into the living rooms of almost every home in America. And in our household, FDR was a demigod. He was the voice that always gave them hope. My parents really worshiped FDR. And it was not just because of policies, they felt connected to him because of that great warm radio voice and that amazing ability that he had to speak directly to the fears and the hopes of the American people.
I can assure you that it is safer for you to keep your money in a reopened bank than to keep it under the mattress.
FDR and the Great Depression and the New Deal was an amazing time because FDR was about establishing hope, trying to bring hope back to life for people that were caught in this unbelievably chaotic period of economic chaos and stress.
In a lot of ways, FDR was actually an extremely unlikely figure to become a sort of moral and visionary leader in the ways that he did. Now, I think there's a great myth of FDR that he came into office, the country rallied around him, and the Depression was eventually solved. But that's not true. FDR was hated passionately by large portions of the population, and yet he did something really significant in those first months. First of all, he acted, and he acted in significant ways, and he came in saying, we can whip this thing, and whether or not he quite did it in those first months, he brought dramatic new ideas to the table and really did upend a lot of assumptions and make the idea that change really was possible a reality in many ways.
This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper.
Anytime we examine the New Deal, the legislation that FDR initiated as swiftly as he took the oath of office, you have to put it in the context of what had come before. We'd had a run of Republican pro-business presidents of the United States. Herbert Hoover was one of them, Cal Coolidge was another one, obviously. FDR came along and determined that something much bolder was needed to save the country, to provide a kind of a lifeboat, if you will, legislatively. So the New Deal was a real upheaval of everything that had gone before. And interestingly, the Republicans in Congress were willing to go along because the country was in such desperate shape. The idea of Social Security, for public works programs, the WPA, the various other agricultural programs, which became critically important to the restoration of American agriculture and the modernization of it. The Republicans were going to try anything at that point because we were on the precipice. The entire country could have gone down, and almost did, from an economic point of view.
So why was he elected president? He promised recovery with a New Deal for the American people. Roosevelt won by a landslide in both the electoral and popular vote, carrying every state outside of the Northeast and receiving the highest percentage of the popular vote of any Democratic nominee up to that time.
October 29th, 1929, the New York stock market crashed, which resulted in the complete meltdown of the American economy, which eventually spread worldwide, including Europe. As a result of the stock market crash, people lost their jobs. Unemployment was over 20%. And in some areas of the country, we reached a total of 50%. There was great migrations from rural areas to urban areas. You also had the Dust Bowl era, where a lot of the young farmers who lost their farms, who couldn't afford a debt, moved to the California area to find work. So there was a massive upheaval in America at the time. President Roosevelt promised a New Deal for the American people to bring about government programs to put men and women back to work, to help all parts of society, including the businessman and the farmer. He also helped to put the banking system back on track, as well as to regulate the stock market to make it run more smoothly. One of the New Deal programs was the Civilian Conservation Act, or CORE. And this was a program for young men. It was sort of a military-style arrangement. They stayed at camps, they had a mess hall, and these men will go out and work, usually in conservation work, building state parks, national parks. Some of our state parks here in Georgia are CCC parks, including the one next door, Roosevelt State Park. They also planted trees throughout Georgia. And also the men of the CCC, whenever they got paid, they were required to give a certain percentage of their money back to their families. The other program, which was the Rural Electrification Administration, and Roosevelt declared Warm Springs as the birthplace of it, was to provide affordable electricity for rural areas. Electricity before REA in rural areas was very expensive, so very few farmers could afford the electricity, and this was a way to provide electricity for rural farmers. And the other, which was the Social Security Administration, was created to provide financial support to senior citizens as well as those who are unemployed. And the Agricultural Adjustment Act, or administration, was created to put regulation in agriculture. Some farmers were producing too many crops, certain were producing less, and that caused fluctuation in prices. and the Agricultural Adjustment Administration was used to regulate the price of agricultural goods and also to pay farmers not to plant on their property to reduce the amount of crops being planted.
Theories regarding resolving the Great Depression. Following his inauguration as President of the United States on March 4, 1933, FDR put his New Deal into action within the first 100 days of his administration. His New Deal was an active, diverse, and innovative program of economic recovery. He made the assumption that the power of the federal government was needed to get the country out of the Depression. The first days of Roosevelt's administration saw the passage of banking reform laws, emergency relief programs, work relief programs, and agricultural programs. Later, a second New Deal was to evolve. It would include union protection programs, the Social Security Act, and programs to aid tenant farmers and migrant workers. In the long run, New Deal programs helped improve the lives of people suffering from the events of the Depression. The first set of programs to tackle the Great Depression. There were many programs that FDR signed into legislation. For example, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the Works Progress Administration, and the National Recovery Administration. But today I'm just going to talk about two. Those two programs will be the Tennessee Valley Authority Act and the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. The Tennessee Valley Authority Act. It was signed into law and allowed the government to begin building dams all along the Tennessee River. This controlled flooding and generated inexpensive hydroelectric power, which in turn helped the people in the region. The TVA Act caused the energy rates to lower, which in turn helped ensure affordable, reliable power for all. It also encouraged economic development and provided jobs by bringing electricity to rural areas. This video goes into more detail.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt ran for president on a platform that promised the American people a New Deal.
More than a political campaign, it is a call to arms. Give me your help not to win votes alone, but to win in this crusade to restore America to its own people.
The United States was several years into the Great Depression. There was mass unemployment, thousands of banks shut down, and farms all over the country were left to ruin. So when Roosevelt entered office, he immediately began an aggressive recovery campaign.
Throughout the Depression, you have been patient. You have granted us wide powers. You have encouraged us with a widespread approval of our purposes. Every ounce of strength, every resource at our command, we have devoted and we are devoted to the end of justifying your confidence. We are encouraged to believe that a wise and sensible beginning has been made.
During his first 100 days, Roosevelt instituted a flurry of new programs aimed at relieving the most devastated segments of the economy. Rural America was on that list, and in particular, the Tennessee Valley.
The Tennessee Valley is a fair cross-section of our country. Some problems of other regions are absent here. Others are more acute than elsewhere. But in the main, the problems of the valley are the problems of America.
Those problems were numerous: heavy flooding, deforestation, land erosion, disease. They all combined to make the Tennessee Valley one of the hardest hit areas of the Great Depression. Spanning 7 states and over 40,000 square miles. The Tennessee Valley was no insignificant subsection of the country, and to give it the help it so desperately needed, on May 18, 1933, President Roosevelt signed the Tennessee Valley Authority Act, creating the Tennessee Valley Authority. The TVA was among the most ambitious of the New Deal programs, with objectives that ran the gamut: flood control, replanting trees, building dams, improving river navigation, modernizing farming techniques, and generating cheap electricity.
Substations such as this, the Tennessee Valley Authority is pushing lines into rural communities. Thousands of counties in America have never enjoyed the benefits of electricity. Linemen from the Alabama Division are bringing with them the medium that will lighten the drudgery of housework and permit wider use of man's greatest natural resource, the power that lies in the might of a river.
The TVA put thousands back to work and spurred wide industrial development, rewriting the social and economic circumstances of a once deeply disadvantaged area. But it didn't come without its costs. The TVA ran into some early controversies, particularly its displacement of residents for the sake of building a system of dams. And there are still debates surrounding the TVA's production and sale of electric power. But for the purposes of bringing the Tennessee Valley back from the brink, the TVA was a certain success. It set an example of recovery for a country burdened by years of hardships.
The Agricultural Adjustment Act. This was another important program of the first New Deal. This program was aimed at limiting crop production, reducing stock numbers, and refinancing mortgages with terms more favorable to struggling farmers. In the long run, farm prices rose. This was due to the farmers being paid to not plant as much cotton, corn, wheat, and other staples. Later on down the road, farm prices were stabilized and thus saved the farms. Although the AAA ended later on down the road, federal farm support programs that arose from the original New Deal policies continued after the war. This video goes more into the AAA.
The Great Depression left millions without adequate food, jobs, or security. Years before this took place, however, another depression in traditional habits had already started afflicting millions of people in the U.S., namely a crisis in its farm economy. Long ago, small family farmers typically had limited profitable income from farming. It wasn't lucrative to be one, but it worked well enough for feeding cities and more rural towns within the region. World War I, however, dramatically changed those traditional patterns of regional food provision. In Europe, many Europeans departed from their homes and onto or away from the battlefields, but this meant many of their farmers too. With less reliable food production to feed their populace and armies because of the war's disruptions, European countries turned to allies like the US to feed them. In order to accomplish this, U.S. farmers began producing surplus food at a more massive scale by borrowing more money to pay for larger acreage and farm equipment. Once World War I began, it stimulated agricultural production into a rare prosperity. But then the war ended. Following post-war recovery, European farmers who returned home didn't require as much U.S. food anymore. Farmers had acquired a hefty debt, and some banks went out of business as a result of farmers not paying their loans. For a decade before the Great Depression hit the general populace, farmers created massive surplus in order to offset the falling price, on top of the surplus already created during the war, which was a self-reinforcing cycle. Farmers began to go bankrupt, and their businesses were collapsing. Rural banks also collapsed and left thousands of customers out in the cold. When FDR was elected into office, he initiated the New Deal in 1933, enacting one of its first laws, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. The intent was to restore purchasing power of commodity crops to pre-World War I levels, specifically 1909 to 1914. Farmers were told to limit their production levels. Those farmers that agreed to the limits were paid a subsidy. As many farmers were in desperate fear for their families being evicted from their land, they eagerly accepted and received checks from the government to pay their debts and taxes. However, there was still a problem of what to do with all the surplus goods. The government took its newly purchased products and began policies like the Hog Reduction Program, introduced by the Secretary of Agriculture, Henry Wallace, leading to the death and disposal of over 6 million hogs. Millions more of healthy cows and sheep were also slaughtered and buried in mass graves. This strategy paid off. By 1935, farmers' income generated upwards of 50% higher than in 1932.
A few of Roosevelt's critics and opponents were Father Charles E. Coughlin, Francis Townsend, Huey the Kingfish Long. Father Charles was a major threat to FDR. Coughlin turned against Roosevelt when he refused to nationalize the banking system and provide for the free coinage of silver. He blamed the Great Depression on an international conspiracy of Jewish bankers. Francis Townsend was a doctor from Long Beach, California. He proposed the old age revolving pension. This plan called for every American over the age of 60 to retire to open up jobs for the young unemployed. The retirees would receive a monthly check for $200, a considerable income during the Depression. Huey Long was a lawyer who became governor of Louisiana. He used strong arm tactics to intimidate the legislature into providing roads and bridges to the poorest parts of the state. He started a movement called Share Your Wealth, with the motto, Every Man a King. Long proposed a 100% tax on personal fortunes exceeding $1 million.
The second set of programs to tackle the Great Depression. In 1935, Roosevelt created the Second New Deal, a more aggressive series of federal programs to help with the Great Depression and help with the economy and lives of American citizens during this hard time. Second New Deal handled reform so that no severe depression would occur in the future. They were the Social Security Act, the Works Progress Administration, and the Wagner Act. The Social Security Act was the first time the government established an economic safety net for all Americans. This included providing unemployment and disability insurance. So basically, it was a safety net for the elderly, unemployed, and disadvantaged Americans. It provided benefit systems for retired, jobless, and disabled people. Continuation. The Works Progress Administration, also known as the WPA, was created to provide unemployed Americans useful work so that they can maintain their skills, and it helped with overall self-respect. It included construction of roads, bridges, and airports. So basically, it provided useful work for millions of Americans so that they can preserve their skills. Over the 8 years the WPA existed, it put roughly about 8.5 million people to work. Some of the work included road work, building public buildings, constructing bridges, and building parks and airports. Next was the Wagner Act. It was created to establish the legal rights of most workers to join labor unions and to bargain collectively with their employers. It was also known as the National Labor Relations Act. It guarantees the right of workers to organize and outline the legal framework for labor unions and management relations. It was also there to protect workers. The act provided a framework for collective bargaining. The Second New Deal wasn't as immediate as the first one, but it did create programs that are still used today, such as the Social Security Act. The New Deal was created to help benefit and improve citizens' life and overall help deal with the Great Depression.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to get a little bit controversial as we discuss the FDR administration's response to the Great Depression. The New Deal. That's the National Recovery Administration, by the way, not the National Rifle Association or the No Rodents Allowed Club, which I'm a card-carrying member of. Did the New Deal end the Depression? Spoiler alert. Yeah. More controversially, did it destroy American freedom or expand the definition of liberty? In the end, was it a good thing? Mr. Green, Yes. Me from the past, you are not qualified to make that statement.
What, I was just trying to be like provocative and controversial. Isn't that what gets views?
Oh, you have the worst ideas about how to make people like you. But anyway, not everything about the New Deal was controversial. This is Crash Course, not TMZ. The New Deal redefined the role of the federal government for most Americans, and it led to a realignment of the constituents in the Democratic Party, the so-called New Deal coalition. Good job with the naming there, historians. And regardless of whether you think the New Deal meant more freedom for more people or was a plot by red shirt wearing communists, the New Deal is extremely important in American history. Wait a second, I'm wearing a red shirt. What are you trying to say about me, Stan? As the owner of the means of production, I demand that you dock the wages of the writer who made that joke. So after his mediocre response to the Great Depression, Herbert Hoover did not have any chance of winning the presidential election of 1932, but he also ran like he didn't actually want the job. Plus, his opponent was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was as close to a born politician as the United States has ever seen, except for kid president. The phrase New Deal came from FDR's campaign, and when he was running, FDR suggested that it was the government's responsibility to guarantee every man a right to make a comfortable living, but he didn't say how he meant to accomplish this. Like it wasn't going to come from government spending, since FDR was calling for a balanced budget and criticizing Hoover for spending so much. Maybe it would somehow magically happen if we made alcohol legal again, and one thing FDR did call for was an end to prohibition, which was a campaign promise he kept. After 3 years of the Great Depression, many Americans seriously needed a drink, and the government sought tax revenue, so no more prohibition. FDR won 57% of the vote, and the Democrats took control of Congress for the first time in a decade. While FDR gets most of the credit, he didn't actually create the New Deal or put it into effect. It was passed by Congress. So WTF-DR was the New Deal? Basically, it was a set of government programs intended to fix the Depression and prevent future depressions. There are a couple of ways historians conceptualize it. One is to categorize the programs by their function. This is where we see the New Deal described as 3 R's. The relief programs gave help, usually money, to poor people in need. Recovery programs were intended to fix the economy in the short run and put people back to work. And lastly, the Run DMC program was designed to increase the sales of Adidas shoes. No, alas, it was reform programs that were designed to regulate the economy in the future to prevent future depressions. But some of the programs, like Social Security, don't fit easily into one category, and there are some blurred lines between recovery and reform. Like, how do you categorize the bank holiday and the Emergency Banking Act of March 1933, for example? FDR's order to close the banks temporarily also created the FDIC, which ensures individual deposits against future banking disasters. By the way, we still have all that stuff, but was it recovery because it helped the short-term economy by making more stable banks, or was it reform because federal deposit insurance prevents bank runs? A second way to think about the New Deal is to divide it into phases, which historians, with their A#1 naming creativity, call the first and second New Deals. This more chronological approach indicates that there has to be some kind of cause and effect thing going on, because otherwise, why would there be a second New Deal if the first one worked so perfectly? The first New Deal comprises Roosevelt's programs before 1935, many of which were passed in the first 100 days of his presidency. It turns out that when it comes to getting our notoriously gridlocked Congress to pass legislation, nothing motivates like crisis and fear. Stan, can I get the foreshadowing filter? We may see this again. So in a brief break from its trademark obstructionism, Congress passed laws establishing the Civilian Conservation Corps, which paid young people to build national parks, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the Glass-Steagall Act, which barred commercial banks from buying and selling stocks, and the National Industrial Recovery Act, which established the National Recovery Administration, which has lightning bolts in its claws. The NRA was designed to be government planners and business leaders working together to coordinate industry standards for production, prices, and working conditions. But that whole public-private cooperation idea wasn't much immediate help to make.
Okay, so the role of Eleanor Roosevelt, she was honestly pretty impressive. She set out to learn about the plight of the nation's poor. She encouraged women to step up during the Great Depression, and she remained persistent and spoke in public at high society clubs. So there was this one time she held her own press conference, which was never done before by the First Lady. and she only let female reporters attend. She was very big on women's rights. She wanted women to have a voice. While married, she traveled around the nation visiting relief projects, surveying work and living conditions, and she reported it all back to President Roosevelt. She also became an advocate of the rights of the needs of the poor and of the minorities and of the disadvantaged. So she was very into the nation, and she would help with like dealing with all the people, and she would report back to the president.
I'll give my first opinion on what I think. I do think that Roosevelt helped to end the Great Depression, but he didn't completely end it. The Great Depression continued into the 70s. Well, it would go away and come back little by little throughout all of the years, all of the decades. But when the Great Depression first started with Herbert Hoover, everything was horrible, but Roosevelt did help to look and see what the problems were and how he can start and to solve them. So he did begin to help end the Depression, but he didn't completely end it. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I don't think he ended it either. I like that he had the plan in place. He had programs in place, but I really don't think that he ended it, but he helped. He helped with it, I guess you could say.
I think he had like a big contribution to it, him helping. I think he gave people hope with the New Deal and his programs and his promises. So I think that's a big reason why he got elected. So yeah, just to copy off.
I also agree that he played a big part in ending the Great Depression. At the beginning of his presidency was the big stock market crash and all the banks went under, and Herbert Hoover wasn't really helping. So Roosevelt came in and he did like the Banking Act, and he overall came out with all these new acts to help America in general. So I think that he played a big part in it as well.
These are our references that we had used throughout our presentation. And that's it.